If you remember high school history class, remember the unit in which you learned about the Renaissance? And one of the first things that you learned in this unit is that the Renaissance means the rebirth or the recovery of antiquity, meaning the ancient period where there were the Greeks and the Romans. During this period, the Renaissance period, after the Middle Ages, they go back into the ancient period and they go and start sculpting busts and sculptures just like the Greek sculptures back in the ancient period, in the 1st century, in the 2nd century, in the 3rd century. That's called the ancient period, called Antiquity. If you see like Michelangelo's David, the statue of David, you'll compare it to the ancient Greek busts that were made out of marble. This is what they were doing during this period. One of the most valuable recoveries from antiquity is actually the recovery of the early church from the book of Acts. If you know like when the Bible takes place in that period in antiquity. In the ancient period where Jesus, he dies in the 1st century, around 33 AD, and then establishes his church when he resurrects from the dead, while he was buried for 3 days in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And he rose from the dead and he established his church at Pentecost in that same year, and the church was established. The book of Acts accounts for the 1st century church, essentially in the most detailed way possible. And so what happens is that when people start to read the Bible after Gutenberg invents the printing press and starts printing a bunch of Bibles, people start reading the Bible. They read the book of Acts, and then they go back to antiquity during the Renaissance period, and they recover the church from the book of Acts, called the early church. This is the beginning of the Protestant movement. These are the Puritans. They go back for a pure tradition of to be just like how it was in the ancient period, in the 1st century, where the Catholic Church was full of paintings and stained glass windows and cathedrals and stuff like that, and a bunch of sacraments of like Mass and confession and a bunch of other stuff, and Hail Marys and all that stuff. And the people went back to the ancient period, into antiquity during the Renaissance, and recovered the early church. And so they started just being simple, like the early church was. They would just meet at Peter's house, or they'd meet at Martha's house, and they'd break bread, and they'd worship God, and they'd preach about Jesus, right? They'd preach on the street. You know, they'd preach loud, like from a pulpit or something like that. They'd go in the synagogue and teach, and they'd create missionaries and have deacons and presbyters rather than bishops and cardinals and popes. They just kept it simple, because this is what we recovered from antiquity. This is a contingent revival from that period in the Renaissance period. But we have now this Puritan church that's different from the Catholic cathedral, this place where like you find like your local church like over on the corner of the street. This is what we recovered during the Renaissance. There's a contingent period between the Renaissance period to the Protestant Reformation, all the way up to the modern period.